Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Developing Effective and Responsive Approaches to Elder Abuse in Tribal Communities, presented by the Elder Justice Initiative. My name is Keely, and I just want to go over a couple technical things with you today before we get started. Your microphone and video have been disabled. The PowerPoint and recording will be posted on the Elder Justice Initiative website in the coming weeks, so keep an eye out for that. Closed captioning is available via the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. We also want to thank our ASL interpreters who are helping us with today's webinar. That interpretation is available via the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any technical issues, please use the chat to message our technical support specialist, Bess Shutterly, and she will support you today. So now I will pass it along to Talitha Gwynn Schaefer with the Elder Justice Initiative to get us started.
Great, thank you so much. Very happy to have all of our esteemed speakers here today to talk about this important topic. I'm Talitha with the Elder Justice Initiative, and I work on the MDT Technical Assistance Project. And our mission here is to help support and coordinate the department's enforcement and programmatic efforts to combat elder abuse and neglect. Next slide. If you haven't been to our website in a while, I encourage you to come on over and take a look. We have lots of wonderful resources for many different professions. Of course, my focus is the MDT area, and we have an MDT guide and toolkit. We also have various recorded webinars and video series for everyone from prosecutors to victim advocates to law enforcement and others. We also have a research section of the website, so you can look at the most current elder abuse research there. Next slide. And I thought we'd start today by just getting a sense of who's in the room. So if we could start with poll 1 and just let us know what your profession is. And you can just choose on your screen, make a selection. And this will sort of help our presenters today to tailor their content a bit where appropriate. And Keely, whenever you feel like we've got bulk response, we can move on. Thank you so much. Lots of victim specialists and APS social workers here as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Go to the next poll. If you are law enforcement, we're wondering if you work with tribal or non-tribal agencies. And Keely, whenever you're ready, you can show our results. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. That's good to know because we'll be talking a lot about collaboration. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is poll number 3. So regardless of your profession, do you have experience working with tribal communities? And we can show the results when you are ready. Oh, good. All right. Well, we have lots of people here who have experience working with tribal communities, so that is really good. Thank you so much. You can go ahead and close out the polls and move to the next slide. So I will hand it over now to Peggy Jo, if you'd like to say a little introduction and hand things off. We're in good hands today. Thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you, Talitha. Thank you for everybody for being here. My name is Peggy Jo. I'm the director of the Elder Justice Projects for IAID Squared, which you will hear throughout the presentation is referred to as IAID Squared, which is the International Association for Indigenous Aging. I just want to start out by saying that our presentation is very broad. Some of the way that we use terminology, we know that won't work in certain communities. However, this presentation is to serve various tribal communities. So understanding that the topic and the topics and content and the way that the presenters present is in a diverse way, so that any nation can pick up what we're saying and using to implement into their communities. Next slide. So I'll start off with who we are and what drives us. Next slide. So I8Squared, which is the International Association for Indigenous Aging, has been around for 20+ years. The agency has really been working in the space of advocating on behalf of tribal elders in terms of elder abuse and elder well-being in different capacities. Next slide. So what we do. So at I8Squared, we have a lot of different projects. We've been on a lot of different projects that are not on the slide, but here are some of our main initiatives that we house within our project or in our organization. So the first one is the Native American Elder Justice Initiative, which is a national resource through a cooperative agreement with ACL, which is the Administration for Community Living. That's where we're presenting from. That's the initiative that we're working under today. However, I8Squared has other resources like our Healthy Brain Initiative, the Kevin and Avanti. Oh, so I'll start with the Healthy Brain Initiative. That's really to focus on bringing awareness and resources to tribal communities around Alzheimer's and dementia care. And then we have the Kevin and Avanti program, which is a wandering initiative. And we are currently working on producing a wandering toolkit that is specifically for tribal communities. And then we have other programs like the evaluation of ADPI projects, and then really advocating for these topics at various levels in different places. Next slide. So I'd like to start our presentation with, and I kind of see some of you guys are doing that now in the chat, but if you'll take a brief moment and just introduce your name, your role, and if you have a tribal affiliation in the chat, and then just give us, if you are from a nation, just give us a little bit of information, like does your nation have an APS program, or does it have Adult Protective Services code, or an elder abuse code, or elder protection code? Just give us a little bit of information. That's really helpful for us to know just as we're presenting, and if we need to add a little bit of that into our presentations. Next slide. And then, as you heard, I'm the director of the Elder Justice Projects. I'm originally from New Mexico. My background, it has always been in violence prevention, and I always tell people one of my most things that I feel like I'm really good at is helping communities mobilize to violence and preventing violence, not mobilize to violence, preventing violence. So having community mobilization. So at the Resource Center, we love to meet with communities and hear what kind of resources they have. What are they doing in terms of recognizing and responding to abuse? And then we take all of that and we kind of help develop plans, or help communities strengthen those efforts to respond to elder abuse particularly. Next slide. I'll let Diane introduce herself.
Bonjour, everyone. My name is Diane Hofstede. I'm with DHS in the state of Wisconsin with the APS team. I'm a Bad River Band of Lake Superior tribal member in Wisconsin. So my background is mainly for the last 30 years of my career, I've been working with in the criminal justice field with vocational rehabilitation, helping individuals re-enter back into their areas of their tribes or community, and assisting them with employment, clothing, and services that they need to lessen recidivism rates. So I've done voc rehab, and I've worked in the community jails and the prisons around the state of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Diane. Next slide. Okay, so as I know, as we did the poll, I saw that there's various professions in here, and all of you are very well first and working in tough topics. However, this is a professional development aspect. Still, please just take care of yourself. These topics are hard to talk about sometimes. We do have a resource on the bottom of the page right there. It's called Strong Hearts Native Helpline. It is a culturally relevant line to talk about if something feels triggering after this conversation. And they don't only just serve people who are within tribal communities. So if you want to call and say, you know, hey, I was in this presentation today, it was around tribal communities, and these are kind of some of my feelings, because that happens. Please call that line. It is a confidential and safe source to use. So please take advantage of that. And if you need that, but also share this as widely as you can. Next slide. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Diane.
Yeah, I'm going to talk today about APS and elder justice in tribal communities. And again, this is, you know, it's not going to be all the same for all communities because all tribal communities are different. Next slide. So while working with APS in the state of Wisconsin, and I haven't been here too long, but the state created a position for working with the tribal communities. And I'm going to reference a lot about Wisconsin because that's what I know. And there might be a lot of other areas that are the same. So Wisconsin is a county-led APS state. So tribes work with their county partners in terms of reporting adult protective services and working with those outcomes. When I started doing this and working with the tribes, I changed up the language that I was using when discussing adult protective services and adults at risk with abuse and neglect, because in those terms and those words are very harsh. So I changed it up a bit, and it was very welcoming across the state of the tribes that I was working with, most of the 11 tribes. And in terms of working with the elders in the communities, because that's the representation that came to our speaking events that we were doing. And I partnered with UW Green Bay, and we talked about, and my the person I partnered with was Deb Lease, and they developed a FAST program for the state of Wisconsin. So her and I would go out, I would talk about APS and she would talk about the FAST initiative. And within that scope of what we were doing, realizing that this is a hard topic, especially when you're presenting to tribal elders in the community. So if I talk about abuse and neglect, I'm probably going to use the word disrespect. In some instances, I can't use that word, but in most cases, when I'm talking about it, that's the word that I'm using because elders were disrespected. And then when I'm talking about people who commit the crimes and those perpetrators, that's another word that's triggering. So we changed that up to wrongdoers. And Deb and I talked in length about this, changing this language, and it was very well received, and we got a lot of good feedback when we did our presentations. Next slide. The types of disrespect, and I know there's a lot of APS individuals on here, so I know that you know, it can be physical and disrespectful, sexual, spiritual. And that is one thing that you'll only hear in tribal communities, that there's spiritual disrespect, and that's taking away their ability to go to powwows or ceremony, or taking their regalia or other items that they hold to their, to use to be able to pray to the Creator. Emotional abuse, financial, and that's what Deb and I presented on. But it's hard sometimes for, and I'll address this later, but it's hard for elders to talk about these things because of the cultural stigma and the historical trauma that's happened. Just a little bit of the pre-pandemic, you know, there was only 1 in 10 that may be reported. Post-pandemic, 1 in 5. And Peggy Jo, if you want to jump in on this, but older adults are there is an age difference too within the tribe, and I'm going to get to that later on. But these are the types of disrespect that happen within tribal communities, in addition to spiritual, language, and there's a form of other abuse that happens. Next slide.
I'll just jump in there for a second.
Yeah.
So, as Diane talked about all these forms of abuse, you know, you will see these in different populations, but I think what's really important here is that when you're working with a tribal elder, and you might not understand what they're sharing with you is an experience of spiritual abuse or another form of abuse, frankly. So it's really important to listen. And if you don't understand what they're sharing with you, seek supervision, seek resources after that to understand the type of experience that they're sharing with you, because victimization to a tribal elder might look different and you might not understand, and you might be missing a big component of or that big experience. And so I always say sometimes they might be sharing something with me and I don't really understand it, but if they're sharing it with me, I must do my work in figuring out what that means to them, because I always take that approach when we're servicing victims. Listen to the experience and how that experience affected them, because oftentimes what we have seen, you see it through the literature, through testimony, is that in tribal elders will, when they do respond or they do report, people sometimes just dismiss it because they don't understand abuse and aging, or they don't understand the context because it's a cultural context. So in this slide is really just reinforcing the need to have that listen a little harder, and if you don't understand, ask somebody, figure out what that really means. And it might mean nothing, but sometimes it might mean experiences of abuse, and that's really connected to that spiritual abuse. Thank you. Next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy Jo. And yeah, that's in terms of working with, you know, like our state and the state of Wisconsin, like I said, we're county led. So it's really important for those counties, and that's part of what I do is those connections with the tribe to the county and the county to the tribe, and having, when there is a report, having that county partner work with the tribal community and the tribal person that handles that and knows most about that, and to be able to work with that elder. And then who commits elder disrespect? Well, nationally, 60% of incidences were committed by family members, and 2/3 of adults or children were children or spouses. But in tribal communities, 80% are family members, and that's just from the National Council on Aging. But it's really prevalent to know that, you know, this can come across the board of who's committing these this disrespect to tribal elders, and that even is a big one is verbal, and it's the elder a lot of times can't identify certain disrespects that they're actually getting. But so we have to really look into that, especially if you're a caregiver in the home, or working with that of, you know, adult elder or adult at risk. You know, listen to their stories, sit down and take the time to spend with them to listen to what they have to say, because the conversation can start out about the weather or food, but it can go into other things, and you'll find out incidences that may or may not have happened. Next slide. Barriers around helping. Like I had mentioned, cultural stigma and historical trauma is huge. And health concerns, you got to know what to look for. But I just want to say, according to the National Center of Elder Abuse, it refers to any of the following types of maltreatment that can happen to someone within an elder of us, in a special relationship. You have to look at those relationships also, and what those barriers could be, and what that elder may be experiencing. They might actually be, when we talk about, neglect, they might be neglecting themselves because of the hopelessness that they feel. And in terms of reporting, when it's hard for a tribal elder to report experiences that might be happening with them. And health concerns, that's another thing. I seen it when I was growing up. I grew up with my grandmother, and she didn't report a lot of times, being sick or something. Just find out that with these cultural differences and values and beliefs and traditions, tribal members have a hard time reaching out for help and reporting certain situations, and that can be across the board with anything, as far as even needing something or finances or anything. There's a lot of barriers that can happen within tribal elder community. Next slide. Next slide. I just want to talk a little bit in general about adult protective services. And being that there's some APS on here, obviously, that it's a social service program focusing on helping older adults with disabilities by investigating allegations of abuse, neglect, self-neglect, etc., and by offering services and support to promote safety and independence. Nationally, APS in Indian country, due to the diverse cultural contents of working with tribes, APS programs should also incorporate cultural sensitivity and respect tribal customs, traditions, and language, both verbally and body language. But the most important thing that I feel when you're working with a tribal member is to go in and listen to what they have to say, and see that body language. Sit down with them and listen to their story, because what they're going to talk about is going to be more in the form of storytelling. They're not going to do a lot of yes and no questions if you bombard them with that, but you're going to get the story out of them, listening to them and what they have to say. And be really careful when you're with a tribal elder about the sensitive issues that may arise, and the language. And like I talked about earlier, it's very important to be aware of that, and APS workers to educate themselves. And the most important thing is not all tribes are the same, so it's going to look different. Their customs and traditions and the language, it's going to look different. That's just the way every tribe is. That's why it's hard to do a best practice, because every tribe is different. Next slide. I want to touch a little bit about age. So the definition of age in tribal communities is not typically a set age. It's a distinct statute of wisdom and knowledge and responsibility. So age factors are different, although there are set ages for our state and different requirements. But when it comes to tribal communities, even Indian Health Services has, they see tribal members as age 55, but when we're talking about in whole a tribal community, really age comes with wisdom and knowledge and what you have given back to that community. So when tribal nations and state work together, it's crucial to understand both state and tribal eligibility requirements to facilitate the communication and collaboration. Next slide. When you're working with tribal elders, ask them, you know, like I was saying previously, it's very important to go in and not right away start bombarding them with a yes and no question. You know, you need to sit down. If they offer you something to drink, take it. That's disrespectful in tribal communities if you don't accept a form of, you know, coffee or water. Obtain permission and talk to them about asking them if you can, you know, talk with them about issues that have come up because of this report. But first you want to get their trust and their having them be able to understand why you're there. Because again, these are tough things. You know, if you have to do an ROI, if they let you do that, that's great. But within our tribal communities, again, I'm going to reference Wisconsin. There are some tribes that have a code that identify elder disrespect and neglect. And then some of them do have MOUs with their county partners. However, in most cases, there isn't a code and there isn't an MOU. So that's what you have to research before. But again, when you're working with a tribal member, it's very crucial when you're talking with them to ask for their permission first and gain their trust and respect. Next slide. Again, we're going to go back to this age. So in most cases, 65 is the standard age of which an individual is considered a elder in American society. Medicaid and Medicare, Social Security, 65. However, in tribal communities, an elder, again, is an individual with a source of wisdom and knowledge and respect that they gave back to their community. And again, IHS is 55 years of age and older, but it's really their teaching wisdom that we look at as tribal members of who's the elder in our community. Next slide. So just to conclude, and I really want to, you know, I wanted to go back to this because I think it's really important. So on a national level, of course, we have best practice in APS, including prioritizing adults, using least restrictive interventions. That's what we want to do, you know, respecting the adult's rights to confidentiality, and conducting thorough investigation while upholding adult rights. And of course, we're going to do this with our tribal members as well. However, in tribal communities, we strive for best practice customized to each tribal community that establishes, prioritizes cultural sensitivity. That's the most important thing. And again, I can't stress enough how every tribe is going to be different. So that's going to look different. Those establishments are going to be different. But this includes a deep community engagement, traditional practices, respecting tribal sovereignty, and tailoring services to keep elders safe. And of course, we always want to remember that we really want to, when working with a tribal member, to have them age in place in their tribal community. Removing them is, in most cases, not an option. They want to remain there and they want to age in place. And we need to do the best that we can do, working with our APS partners, working with our tribal law enforcement, our county law enforcement, our state law enforcement, and social services to keep that elder safe while we address the situation and investigate and do a thorough case evaluation, all while we are keeping that cultural sensitivity intact. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. That was really good. I'm going to briefly go through just the systems and how some tribal communities have developed some of their codes and best practices for developing codes. Next slide. So what is an elder abuse code? I often get asked this, especially if the professional is not working on a tribal nation or through collaboration. Next slide. So the National Indian Council on Aging, this is a recommendation. All of this information that I'm presenting on, we do have a toolkit on the website that was created and that you can use if you are needing to start developing your code or revising your code. But a tribal elder abuse code allows tribes to create laws that protect older adults from abuse, neglect, exploitation within their jurisdiction. Those codes define the identification and resolutions of abuse. So if you are a law enforcement officer that is not tribal, best practices if you're to look at the nation that is within your jurisdiction or your service area to see if they have an elder abuse code. Read that elder abuse code, become well versed in that, even though it's not your jurisdiction, but you might be providing aid or support or resources. So it's just really important as that part of it is to know the code, but also know that each of those codes are also developed through various ways. So the codes are not just a law, it has values, customs, and beliefs incorporated into those codes. So that's what makes these codes specific to each nation. So not all nations have the same code. And even if for example, like Diane said, in Wisconsin, there's 11 nations. They all don't have the same code, even though they're in the same area. Their codes are going to be look vastly different because they all have different customs and ways of addressing elder abuse in their community. So again, there's a toolkit on this on our website. The links are below on the slide. Next slide. And then part of developing elder abuse codes, there are 8 steps, and these are the 8 steps that are recommended to take when developing a code. So just understanding these are the ways that somebody gets to a full code that can be implemented. I say that I always tell people that I'm working with developing a code, it's not best practice to skip these steps, but sometimes we do come and work with some nations that are on step 3, and we are able to work with them from all the steps, or sometimes we recommend going all the way back to step 1. Codes take a very long time to develop. People always ask me, how long does it take? Or sometimes people come to me with the perception that they could be developed in a few weeks. On average, what I have heard, an elder abuse code takes on average between 3 and 5 years. We just met with someone yesterday and it said they took 2 years. And so we've seen a variety of ways. It's just like telling somebody, why can't you just change the law or create a new law? There is an entire process. And these are the 8 steps that are recommended, but each nation has their own processes that they have to take within their nations based off of their roles and responsibilities. Next slide. Elder protection teams. Next slide. In the chat, put in the chat if you have an elder protection team. Sometimes nations that do not have stand-up or standalone adult protective services programs or a code, or they might have all of it and have an elder protection team. But what I tell some nations that don't have codes or don't have an adult protection services, let's start with developing an elder protection team. So you have a team of professionals that are ready to respond when there is a case of elder abuse. And so here are just the various reasons on why it's important to develop an elder protection team. Next slide. And then this model is modeled off the Confederate Tribes of Warren Springs. They have been recognized for one of the longest standing and most effective community elder protection teams. And so you'll see below on here the various roles that they have on their elder protection teams. And mindful, those are all those players or those professionals on that team make a successful elder protection team. So these are just examples and recommendations of who you should have on your elder protection team. And so again, toolkit is on our website, can be downloaded, shared, and used whenever. And we would love to support your nation doing each of these steps, whether that's elder abuse code or an elder protection team. Next slide. All right, I'm going to hand it over to David.
Good morning. My name is David Rogers. I'm a Nez Perce tribal member. This is my 51st year in public safety, including law enforcement and training and technical assistance. I have 22 years in law enforcement, including several positions as chief of police for both tribal and non-tribal agencies, and have spent the last 29 years doing training and technical assistance for a variety of federal organizations and my own organization. And so my section on this is to talk a bit about law enforcement and the approaches that law enforcement needs to take. I currently work for an organization called Justice and Security Strategies as their senior tribal public safety advisor. And prior to that, I was with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington State, serving as the MMIP coordinator for the U.S. attorneys working with the 29 tribes of Washington. And when we were developing training and assistance on MMIP issues, the things that both Diane and Peggy Jo just echoed is really important to understand if you're not familiar with Indian country, is that all the tribes are very different. You cannot paint Indian country with one brush. And in recognizing that, we also worked with tribes to develop tribal community response plans to missing person cases, and they're individually written by each tribe, and it focuses on the tribe's culture, the tribe's demographics, the tribe's history, what resources they have. So what resources one tribe might have, the next tribe down doesn't. And so even when it comes to victim services, we worked with tribes that had no victim services in their tribal programs at all. And so how do they overcome that, or how do they address that as they're developing these programs? The other thing that was really important and obvious to us, and we've been looking at this going clear back into the early 80s, where Peggy Jo was just talking about elder protection teams, and that's multidisciplinary teams working on specific issues. And back in the 80s, we started forming multidisciplinary teams to work on child abuse cases, so that children weren't re-victimized over and over and over again by all the different involved government entities who were in charge of investigating and or the welfare of the victim in that case. And that applies here too. And it applies in missing person cases. It applies everywhere. And elders are part of the missing person issues, which is why that's important to me. Because if you look at the categories of missing person cases, there's one big one called medical missing. And those are elders who have suffering from cognitive issues where they walk off or wander off and they become a missing person, and sometimes those outcomes are not good, and so a lot of effort is made to try to adjust that. And then of course elders are often victims of crime, so they can become missing persons in other areas. So it all ties in together. And so when Peggy Jo asked if I would assist with this, I was more than happy to do so. So I thank you guys for inviting me. Next slide. So one of the things, especially for those not familiar with Indian country, is jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is a very complex issue in Indian country, and it impacts how and what law enforcement may respond to a particular thing, and or what services are available or provided to a particular situation. And I mean, if you were to go, and I see several attorneys in here, including Ann Keller from Nez Perce, I see you on there. They can tell you that, if you're going to study tribal federal state jurisdiction, you're going to spend several semesters in law school doing that. But in a nutshell, each of these government entities have different roles and responsibilities in their respective jurisdictions. And tribes are different again throughout the nation based on where they are, what their history is, how their government and how their sovereign status and development of their public safety programs evolved. So you have the very complex issues involving Public Law 280 tribes. You have tribes that have no law enforcement programs. You have those that have great relationships with their neighboring agencies, and some that have horrible relationships with their neighboring agencies, and that gets very complex. And should victimization reach a felony level in Indian country, then you've got the federal government stepping in, because the federal government has responsibility for major crimes in Indian country. They work hand in hand with the tribal or sometimes state, depending on, again, what jurisdiction this was. So jurisdiction is as complex as everything else. And so that's going to alter from state to state, tribe to tribe, when these kinds of cases are being investigated, who's going to be involved. So in a nutshell, I just want to emphasize how complex this can get. Next slide. So one of the things with tribal agencies, and I have traveled Alaska and the United States, lower 48, visiting tribal agencies for a lot of years, and I've witnessed the evolution of tribal policing. I started policing in 1974, and I was down at the Blackfoot City Police near the Fort Hall Indian Reservation in Idaho. And in 1974, policing was very different than it is today. And so I've been able to witness the evolution of policing over these tremendous amount of years. And I watched tribal policing specifically evolve into some of the best organizations I've ever worked with or seen. But some of the things that are emphasized with tribal law enforcement are the cultural sensitivity to the culture that they work for, what tribe they're working with. Many tribes require that officers coming on board, and we do have a lot of non-tribal officers who work for tribal agencies. We have members of other tribes working for different tribal agencies, and it's important for them to know the history and the culture of the tribe they're working for. It would be like if you went overseas to work for a law enforcement agency in Eastern Europe. You would want to know the cultural language and history of that community if you're going to be effective. And so tribes do in many cases require officers to become aware of all this and address that when partnering with other entities that are working there. When I started actually with the COPS office with the Department of Justice in 2000, introducing the concept of community policing to tribes, which is kind of interesting because tribes prehistorically have always been engaged in community policing. That's how they functioned. And so it was kind of interesting that we were going back to teach community policing to communities that had been doing it for centuries. But it is a natural fit. If the police could solve all problems, we wouldn't need all of this, but they can't. And so again, that multidisciplinary approach involving people and community and other organizations to work together hand in hand to look at study from a variety of different perspectives and come up with approaches to deal with problems in the community is by far the best and most efficient way to go. So tribal law enforcement is encouraged to be engaged and involved in the community at all aspects, culturally as well. And it always made me happy to see my officers showing up at tribal ceremonies and tribal cultural events and participating and being engaged and being available to the communities when they're there. Collaboration with APS and other victim service organizations and outreach is vital. I can remember times where OVC would have a conference and you'd have all your victim services folks there and no law enforcement. And I remember we had a conference in Arizona where it was encouraged that each victim service person bring a police officer from their community to the training. And when the training started, all the police officers were sitting on one side of the room and all the victim services people were on the other side of the room. By the end of that week, we had everybody sitting together and engaging, and that's what we have to do. We have to get out of our silos and engage and work together in order to have the best outcomes for this. Next slide, please. So the differences between the different agencies, what their authority is, what resources they have. Some tribal police are resource rich. They're doing very well compared to what it used to be, but other tribal agencies are very, very resource poor. They suffer with issues of numbers of employees, the areas that they have to cover, which can be tremendously large with hardly any other personnel, equipment, training, experience. Sometimes tribal police unfortunately get used as training grounds for people that want to get their certifications and then move on to other agencies. So there is those challenges. Having those culturally coordinated responses, which are brought into the police training with tribal police, is really important for their ability to work within the communities, language issues included. And then working together, getting everybody to get on the same page. And I'll be the first to admit, I've worked in agencies where the peer agencies didn't play well in the sandbox together. And all that does is hinder investigations and cause more harm and damage to victims. So it's really imperative that agencies really go to a task and learn to work together and share information and resources. Next slide, please. So all officers, every officer on every department should be trained in elder abuse investigations, and no different than child abuse investigations or domestic violence investigations. Every crime out there has an investigation strategy to it, and elder abuse is no different. But I can remember back in my beginning days, there was no such thing. You went to the call, you took it, wrote up a report and filed it, and that was it. It's much more complex now than it used to be. And so we're asking a lot of officers to learn about how to do these kinds of investigations. And as mentioned by Peggy Jo, the thing about being educated and how to do these things, first of all, is to eliminate the stereotypes and the myths about elders, and to work with them in a manner that is going to best serve them in these kinds of cases. Don't assume anything about an older citizen. Don't assume they don't understand anything. Don't assume they can't hear you or understand you. Don't assume they can't tell you what happened. They can. And so the biggest thing with police officers is develop patience. I realize, and again, this goes back to resources. If you've got call after call after call and it's stacking up on you and you've got all kinds of things going on, you want to rush in, you want to rush, get whatever you got to get and get out, go to your next call. This can be very challenging because in these kinds of cases, you've got to take your time. You've got to allow the time to gather the information that you need. So you have to have patience in all your cases, but this kind of case in particular. Being a police officer, you can be very intimidating. You're wearing all that equipment, you're wearing the vest, you're wearing all the stuff, and that can intimidate anybody. Heck, it intimidates me when I get pulled over for speeding, and they come up, and that's intimidating. So imagine an elder person who's in their home, and all of a sudden this officer's there. You have to get to their level, get eye level with them, sit down, be present for them, let them know that you're there for them, and don't be in a rush. The other big thing is listen to what they've got to say. And as was just mentioned, they're probably going to talk to you in a storytelling way. They're going to tell you a story. And you have to have the patience to listen to that story because it will come around to the points that you're trying to get to. And so don't get frustrated and impatient and antsy. Listen to them and make them as comfortable as possible so they'll feel good about telling you this story. It's not easy for them either to have to do this, especially if some of the topics they're talking about are very sensitive. So the patience and the listening are a huge part of this. Next slide, please. I'm trying to hurry. Sorry. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just want law enforcement to be aware that EAGLE, which stands for Elder Abuse Guide for Law Enforcement, was created by the Department of Justice and the Elder Justice Initiative. This is the kinds of training that's out there for law enforcement to get in understanding elder abuse investigations. This training is available in person. You can make a request for this training. They'll deliver it on site, or you can do it online, or they can send you the books and the guides and the videos off the shelf, if that's how you want to do it. But it's available in any way that you can get it. But it's broken down into a variety of sections. Like before you interview an elder, study the case, do your homework, understand everything that's going on there. Look at any past reports. Be prepared when you go in there in advance to provide alternative ways to communicate. If you need an interpreter, you don't want to wait until you get there and find out you need an interpreter. Get one if you need one in advance, if you know that. Make sure it's in a safe, comfortable place for the elder. Maybe not the police station, not an interview room. Wherever the elder feels comfortable, that's where you're going to want to do that. And serve them. What's the best time of the day for them? What's the best location for them? And give them the time for the interview. Next slide, please. Adopt a strength-based approach. We teach this at the Tribal Probation Academy, strength-based approaches. What are the strengths and the positives of the elder, and work with those, and treat them with the dignity and the respect and the transparency that they deserve. They earned that right to be where they are, and so we want to provide that respect and dignity to them. Build rapport and be respectful in your communication. Talk with them. I mean, sometimes you're going to visit about stuff that's not even relevant to the case, but that's just part of that rapport building, finding common ground, establishing that communication style that you're going to use with them. Make sure they understand who you are, even though you're wearing a uniform. Tell them who you are and what you're doing there, what the interview is for, and what the process is going to be. Watch for their verbal requests, watch for nonverbal clues, and you do that anyway as you're working through the day, but watch for those clues there too. If the elder wants something, a comfort item, let them have it. If you have that rapport going with your victim advocates, your APS, any support people, support animals, or therapy animals, if they want that and you can get it, do that. If you have any cultural or faith-based liaisons that are out there, and you can use them, and the elder wants them, then make sure you have that. Be aware of what resources you have in your community and have them pre-prepared for any of these events. And if this is going to be a longer interview, provide water, snacks, and breaks as the elder needs it. Bathroom breaks and that type of thing. Don't just keep them there. They're being interviewed, not interrogated. So we want to give them that courtesy. Next slide, please. Be reassurative. Again, know your resources. If the person that you think has harmed the elder is in the house, separate them. Interview them separately from anybody else there, unless it's a support person that they need. Some officers think you can't interview somebody that may be suffering from dementia or other cognitive challenges, but you can, and it just takes time, and you have to work with it, and you'll get some information out of that. So again, that patience there. So remain objective and adaptable. Be friendly, warm, and conversational. Just be a human, and you'll get a lot from that. Next slide, please. Again, just interviewing, open-ended questions, questions that encourage them to tell the stories. Avoid all the jargon stuff that cops tend to use. Speak in their language, speak in the words that they would appreciate, and engage in an active listening. Repeat what they've told you. Reflect on what they just said to you. If you didn't understand it, ask them to explain it again so that you make sure that you have that understanding. And then, of course, for law enforcement, record and document this interview. And if this particular case turns out to be nothing, it's important that you document this anyway, because it may come up again, and that your interview and the time you spent with them may become very important in the future. Next slide, please. again, first, if you go to the Eagle site on IACP, you can get the Elder Abuse First Responder Checklist. Airplane pilots do a checklist before they take off and when they land. They land and take off a dozen times a day, but they do that checklist every single time, even though they know this. It's just so you don't make a mistake. There is an Elder Abuse First Responder checklist on the IACP Eagle site, and you can check it down there as you go through everything. Make sure you've not missed anything, and that becomes a very key document in your investigation. And eventually, if there's a prosecution, there's going to be that as well, and then you keep it in the file. And take note of the conditions. Look for signs. Not only look for signs of abuse, but look for signs of being cared for as you do this. And so again, all of the types of abuse that Diane talked about, all of the signs for all of those things. One of the most difficult ones, of course, is financial abuse. That takes some serious investigation tools and a lot of training to be able to do that. But again, take a look at that checklist, and it has this and a whole bunch more. Next slide, please. All of that. Next slide. So evidence-based approach to strength outcome, that's the strength and multidisciplinary team approach. It works. It's been proven to work for decades now. And that's what you need with elder abuse, having a multidisciplinary team put together by all of those folks. I believe Diane mentioned MOUs, MOAs. Those are very important between agencies if you're not within the same government organization. And so there is a training, and I just want to reference that for you on the next slide. Oh, one last thing. In law enforcement, support tribal justice and healing programs. If the tribe has peacemaking and they need you to be part of that, then become part of that. Any restorative justice programs that they have going, talking circles, any traditional practices, be involved, be engaged, and feel free to educate outside assisting agencies on these processes so they have an understanding of what it does and how it works and the importance it is to the community and to the individuals. And then my last slide, I'm sorry, this is taking a little bit long. If you're interested in a free training on developing MOUs and MOAs between tribal organizations and outside agencies, the Western Community Policing Institute offers that training for free. That's Dr. Brian Kaufman's phone number and email. This is a byproduct of our Operation Lady Justice work that we did for MMIP. And so this is still out there and still available. They're more than happy to bring the training out to your community, invite your outside agencies in, and you can work on that. Sorry that took a while, but I wanted to get through it all. So thank you very much, Peggy and Diane.
Thank you, everybody. We'll hand it over to Talitha and her team.
Looks like we have a couple of minutes. And so Peggy, there were a couple of questions in the chat. Do you think you have time to address them?
Yes, yes. So you'll see on the ends of these slides, there are just resources for everything that we went through. So we don't need to go through those today, but there are two questions, and I will pass one to Diane and one to David. The first question, Diane, they're not on here anymore because there's been so many. The first question, sorry, if you can read it, people keep scrolling, so it keeps losing it for me.
The question was about tribal elders telling stories with songs and or prayers. How is it that they convey some of their stories?
That's hard to answer, again, because every tribal community is different. Every tribal member is different, so they're going to convey it mainly in a storytelling way. But, there might be, like even David had referenced, when you're in there or working in their home or working with a tribal member, a tribal elder, you have to look for everything, and it might not be all negative. So you need to look around, their home, but you need to stay really transparent with them, meaning gaining their trust, open up and explaining why you're there, and communicate with them. and allow them to share a story. And again, I can't say it enough, like what David said, you have to be patient because this might not, you're not following a time clock when you go in and work with the tribal elder. You're allowing them to share their experiences, and it's going to probably come in a storytelling way, which is going to take longer than your hour that you might have designated. So, be patient, allow them to speak, but also explain to them why you're there. And they may, show you pictures, they may show you regalia, they may show you something that's tied into their story or song. It just depends on the tribal elder and that community.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that. And we know that storytelling and song sharing is a big part of the tribal community tradition. However, we have to really understand that this is part of victimization, and there's concerns of confidentiality and concerns of just shame. So sometimes it's not in a storytelling song way that we would traditionally see shared. It's in a longer form of sharing an experience that turns into a story light. It's probably not the same as what we're thinking because there's victimization attached to that. So it's similar but different because of victimization. And then I will let the next question be asked to David.
The next question was about tribal elder codes and if they apply to Canada as well.
Well, each tribe is responsible for development of their own code, and it's going to apply in their jurisdiction with their tribal community. Up in Canada, again, I'm not completely familiar with how that works there, but even here in the United States, where we have PL 280 states, some tribes are limited on their elder codes to be civil more than criminal. And if they do have their own criminal authority, then they can add that to the criminal code, however they're set up. So up in Canada, I would suspect that each tribe would have to develop their own code individually and manage it in whatever way they're allowed to do so.
And I'll just add a little bit to that too. And we do have tribal nations that are on those borders of Canada. And I haven't seen any yet, but that doesn't mean that there's not room for formal agreements through MOUs with Canada and the nations that are bordering each other. And that would be case by case of each nation. But that's all we have for today. Please reach out to any of us if you guys want to talk through anything. Again, the Resource Center, NAGE Resource Center, we provide technical assistance on all of what we presented on today. So please reach out to us, use our resources, share them as widely as you can. And thank you guys for being with us today.
Thanks.